And welcome. This is the first time we've been together in person for the UCCS Speaker Series in something like 2.5 years. So it's really amazing, and it's good to be here in person again. We think we have a great kickoff event today. You know, over this past 2.5 years, California policymaking certainly hasn't slowed down, and we've tried not to slow down either here at the center. As many of you know, we've had speaker series events held virtually, and today, in fact, much of our audience is attending virtually, along with the in-person audience that we have here. I know as director of UCCS that you're committed, like I am, to the proposition that understanding issues better, more completely, can lead to better policy, and that means generating and using knowledge. And there's hardly any place in the world that's better at generating knowledge that's applicable to policy than the University of California. So we're very proud at UCCS to be affiliated with UC and to be a conduit for the sharing of that knowledge with our policy community. This year, as in the past, we focus on 3 themes. And so you'll see many talks related to rebuilding our public health infrastructure, addressing the homeless crisis, particularly as it relates to mental health, and confronting drought and extreme heat. But today we examine the backdrop to all that, which is politics. And we're very fortunate to have 2 experts on the unique political landscape of California. Ben Hyden, to my far left, is professor and chair of political science at UC Davis, where he's been a faculty member since 1999. Prior to coming to Davis, Professor Hyden earned his PhD at UC Berkeley, and he was a congressional fellow at the US Senate. An accomplished researcher and teacher, he was a Carnegie Scholar and currently serves as a member of the American National Election Studies Board. Eric Engstrom, on my immediate left, is also a professor and also a past chair of political science at UC Davis. You survived that. He specializes in the study of the US Congress, political parties, and American political development, and he's the author of 4 books, most recently, The Politics of Ballot Design, but also the still very timely Partisan Gerrymandering and the Construction of American Democracy. Prior to coming to UC Davis, he earned his PhD at UC San Diego, and he spent 5 years on the faculty at the University of North Carolina. So just a word about format. As I mentioned, this is hybrid. We hope that the audiovisuals all work and that you in our live audience, as well as our studio audience out there in virtual land, will be able to see and hear. The sound for our virtual audience is one way, so you can hear us, hopefully, but we cannot hear you, and therefore questions will be alternated between the live audience and the virtual audience. If you're in the virtual system, please type in your questions in the chat because we will not be able to hear you. So type them in the chat. So without further ado, then please join me in welcoming Professor Ben Hyden and Eric Engstrom.
Let me see. And of course, the slides are not working just yet, but maybe that'll click in. At the outset, let me just say thank you to Rich and everyone here at UCCS for inviting us. It's a pleasure for us to be here. I look forward to sitting in the chair that Eric is currently sitting in with my new or whoever my colleague who will be taking over my role as department chair when I'm done happens. But in the meantime, I'm the chair of the political science department. Eric is my most immediate predecessor. We also have long roots here at UCCS. We both have spent time teaching here before Rich took over, and the sort of educational foundation here got expanded considerably. But Eric and I also have great affection for the time that we spent coming here over from Davis to teach undergrad seminars and the like as part of the UCCS educational program. So we are happy to be here today. When we talked about what we wanted to do in this presentation, we thought we would do, what we thought about is giving you a broad backdrop to California politics as we head into these fall elections, I'm a specialist on public opinion and voting behavior, so I'm going to talk about some of the mass politics side of things. Eric is an expert on, among other things, legislatures, legislative behavior. And so he's going to talk about some things related to the legislative elections. We are painting a broad brush here, with the idea being that we've got lots of specifics that we would be more than happy to talk about, but we'll sort of defer to all of you to see what those specifics might be, and then we'll do our best to answer your questions. Okay, so let's proceed. Let me put my glasses on. So we do have a little bit of a problem that it's not just the clicker, but I'm unable to advance any of the slides. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so as I said, I am going to talk about public opinion, mass politics in California. And to give the broad context, what I want to do is reinforce something that we probably all know at some level. And I just want to make clear just how democratic a state California is, and just how liberal a state California is. And here I'm talking about the people in California as opposed to the legislators, which Eric will have something to say about shortly. So 2 broad points: California being democratic and California being liberal. Let's start with the democratic side. And these 2 things, especially in a polarized political world, certainly go together. California is a democratic state. Just how democratic is it? We can see from a variety of ways. The first way that I want to talk about has to do with what we call party identification. So if you ask people, do you typically identify with the Democratic or the Republican Party, or perhaps neither party? In California, based on extensive survey data, Democrats clearly outnumber Republicans, and they do so by a considerable margin. In the data that I'm looking at, which are consistent with just about any quality data that you might look at, Democrats outnumber Republicans by close to 30 points, 27 percentage points in this case. That is a substantial margin, especially when we consider that in the United States as a whole, Democrats also outnumber Republicans, but the margin is much less, just 7 points. So Democratic partisanship runs 20 points ahead in California compared to the country as a whole. We can look at California compared to the country as a whole, and we can also ask, well, what about on a state-by-state basis? How do things look? And when we do that, we will also see California being quite democratic. What are we looking at here? On the y-axis, on the sort of vertical axis here on the side, we're looking at the Democratic margin. So positive numbers mean there's more Democrats than Republicans in a state. Negative numbers mean more Republicans than Democrats in a state. So one thing you can immediately see before you try to squint and see what's going down there at the bottom is that there's a lot of variation across the states. There are more than a few states that are Republican. There are more than a few states that are Democratic. And there are also states that are quite close to the margin between being evenly split. California is that black bar toward the right on your side. And so California sits comparable to Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New York, Maryland, and Hawaii in terms of how democratic it is. Those are your 7 most democratic states, and California is clearly in that group. And the differences among those within the group are actually quite small. So it's hard to see a state that is significantly more democratic than California. We see other states that are democratic, but not as democratic as California. And of course, if we go all the way to the left, we see states like Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, Alaska, South Dakota, Oklahoma. And these are our heavily Republican states. Party identification tells us California is a democratic state. A manifestation of partisanship is, of course, voting. Presidential voting is useful to look at because it's the same 2 candidates on the ballot, well, the same 2 major party candidates on the ballot across all 50 states. So we can say, how does California look compared to the country overall and the other states when we look at presidential voting? And to avoid seeing too much in any single election. What I've got here for you are averages across the three most recent presidential elections, 2012, 2016, and 2020. So 2012, we have Obama's reelection. 2016, we have Trump's election. And 2020, we have Biden's election. And as we see here, it coincidentally turns out to be the case that the margin in Democratic partisanship is matched by the same margin in presidential voting over the last three presidential elections, where Democratic votes have outnumbered Republican votes by 27 percentage points. Across those same three elections in the country as a whole, Democrats have averaged almost 4 points more. And then if we do the same thing that we did with party identification and we array the states, we see once again, California far on the right-hand side of this graph, which means Democratic voting outnumbers Republican voting by substantial degrees. And once again, it's California with Massachusetts, Maryland, Vermont, and Hawaii as being among the most Democratic voting states. So whether it's something about yourself or social identification, whether it's how people actually vote, California is notably Democratic and notably more Democratic than many other places in the country. One other useful point of reference that especially the younger people in the crowd may not know is that this has not always been the case by any means. An easy way to see that is to look at presidential voting, not just in the three most recent presidential elections, but going back a handful of elections. And when we do that, what we see is that the California of today is notably different than the California of the recent and more distant past in terms of the degree to which it is Democratic. So on the far right here, we have our four most recent presidential elections, and we see Democratic candidates getting more votes than Republican candidates on the order of 20 to 30 points. The four elections just before that, from 1992 to 2004, clearly Democrats getting more votes than Republicans, but only on the order of about 10 points, which is notably less than they are now doing, but is also notably more than the Democratic Party was doing from 1968 to 1988. Across those six presidential elections, Republicans actually outpolled Democratic presidential candidates in every single one of those. California used to be a Republican state. Now it is a Democratic state, and most recently it's become a very Democratic state. Suffice to say, political scientists and others have spent a fair amount of time trying to understand this change and how this change in California might relate to broader changes in American society. And we would be happy to answer questions about that, though perhaps not definitively. But clearly, what the California we're seeing today is not the California of the past. Okay, so California is Democratic. California is also liberal. How liberal is California? Well, we ask people about their partisan identification. We also ask them about their ideological identification. And what we find when we do that is that in California, people who identify as liberals outnumber those who identify as conservatives. The gap here is not nearly as great as the gap in partisanship, but we do have more people who say they're liberal than conservative by about 12 percentage points in recent polls. Compared to the country as a whole, people who identify as liberal are actually outnumbered by those who identify as conservative. So in California, we have more self-identified liberals than conservatives. In the country as a whole, we have more conservatives, more people who identify as conservatives than liberals. Across all the states, you see that in that the vast majority of these bars are all in negative territory, which means conservatives outnumber liberals. California is one of 6 states where that is not the case, and it should not surprise any of us at this point to learn that California is paired with New York, Rhode Island, Hawaii, Massachusetts, and Vermont is the only states where liberals outnumber conservatives. In a highly polarized world where partisanship and ideology go hand in hand, the states that are the most democratic are also the ones that are the most liberal, though the Democratic margins clearly far exceed the liberal margins, as we've seen just looking at these graphs. All right, so we've got Democrats, we've got liberals. We can also look at specific policy preferences as another way to get a handle on how liberal Californians are. And so I have some data for you on that too, just to underscore how liberal the state is with respect to policy preferences. Ask people about legalizing cannabis. Do you think that the use of cannabis should be legal or not? If we look at answers to this question in recent surveys, in California, 78% say yes, 15% say no, 7% are unsure. The liberal margin there is quite large, 63 percentage points. Yeses outnumber noes by 63 percentage points. One of the major changes in public opinion across the country has been with respect to legalizing cannabis. So even in the United States as a whole, there is a substantial liberal margin. But even here, let's note, California is 14 points more liberal than the United States when it comes to legal marijuana. Guns, another one of the hot policy topics on the national and state agendas. Do you favor or oppose stricter gun control laws? In California, favoring as opposed to favor in contrast to oppose, the liberal margin is 28 points. California is more liberal than the country as a whole, where the margin is just 8 points. Abortion, another very important policy area that is also highly salient, has been highly salient for a while and has only grown in salience this year in particular. Do you think abortion should be legal in all or most cases or illegal in all or most cases, or are you unsure? Very few people in public opinion polls are now unsure about their abortion preferences. In California, those who believe it should be legal in all or most cases outnumber those who think it should be illegal by 46 points, a margin that's more than double the liberal margin that exists in the country as a whole. So partisanship, ideological identification, policy preferences, all these things tell us just how democratic and how liberal the state is. What are the implications of that when we talk about public policy? Well, certainly then we would expect that when given the chance, we would expect the California electorate to adopt liberal policies. And as we all probably know, the California electorate is regularly given the chance to adopt liberal policies through the ballot proposition process. I'll just note now, and then we can perhaps discuss if people are interested, the question of whether the electorate should be given the chance to adopt liberal policies. At least within the political science world, the question of direct democracy, which voting on ballot propositions is, contrasts with representative democracy, where we don't choose policies, we choose representatives who then enact policy. But in California, whether or not we think it's a good or a bad thing, it is certainly what we have, and so it's something that we need to think about. And then I'll just note, without going into details at this point, we do have 7 statewide ballot propositions that are on the ballot for this fall. Some of them can be construed in liberal and conservative terms, some not so much. We've got some polling data on some of these 7. We've got insights into other aspects of some of the 7. And like I said, we'd be happy to talk about any of these in more detail, but I'm not going to do that here because we don't know how interested people actually are. So you take the public opinion in a state like California, you got ballot propositions, you would look to see how that translates into direct democracy outcomes. And then, of course, also public opinion of ordinary Californians is incredibly important, because ordinary Californians are the people who elect state legislators and the governor, who then, through representative democracy, also make an enormous amount of public policy. Big picture, broad brush, we expect the Democratic Party to do well in state elections, and we expect the policies that are enacted to be liberal, because while there's no reason to expect a perfect relationship between public opinion and public policy, decades and decades and decades of research, whether in political science or not, show us that there is a strong association between those. So whether it's direct democracy or representative democracy, given where Californians are now, we have this expectation for liberal public policy. We can go into the weeds about some of that, but we'll do that if you want to after Eric Engstrom, my colleague, talks about some aspects of the state legislature and the governor with respect to public policy making. So let me turn it over to Eric.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to just talk briefly about the upcoming elections and what one should expect for representation in the California legislature. And then I'm going to show you some data on how the California legislature compares to other state legislatures in the country. And very much in keeping with what Professor Heighton just discussed, we'll see that California is very democratic and very liberal state. But just how democratic and how liberal is it will be a question that we can look at. So first, just some words on the upcoming legislative elections. This is elections in 2022. So these will be new maps that we'll be using for both the state assembly and the state senate. So every 10 years, every state across the country has to redraw its legislative maps to adhere to redistricting rules. California is no different, as we hopefully know. In California, we use a redistricting commission. So some states, redistricting is done by partisan legislators. And if you've paid attention to some of the redistricting battles in places like Florida or Ohio or North Carolina, you know that it can be quite partisan. And in California, it used to be quite partisan until we moved to a redistricting commission system. And so out of those maps that the commission produced, one can make some forecasts about what the upcoming elections should look like. There's a great data source I put up here called Plan Score, where they take past election results, plug them into the new district lines, and one can make some forecasts using past presidential election results in the new districts and some other party data, and just make some forecasts about what the upcoming election should look like. So in the assembly, there are 80 total seats. The current breakdown as of right now, there are 60 Democrats, 19 Republicans, and 1 independent. Based on the new maps, the prediction would be that there are about 54 solid Democratic assembly districts, 8 that lean Democratic, 8 that lean Republican, and 10 solid Republican districts. And so if you take that and I combine that with some on the ground data based on the primary results from earlier this year, one would expect the Democrats to win about 62 to 63 seats. So a slight gain over their current 60-seat majority. 62 to 63 seats, that's a pretty large majority. So as we'll see, California is one of the more democratic states in the union in terms of its legislature. The other critical thing there to note, and I'll say why this is in just a few minutes, is that puts them well above the 2/3 threshold for a supermajority in the assembly. So one would expect the Democrats to have more than the 54 seats that are needed to have a supermajority in the assembly. What about the Senate? The Senate has staggered elections. So there are 40 total seats in the state Senate. 20 are up in any given 2-year election cycle. So we'll have 20 state Senate races this year. The current party breakdown in the Senate is, again, very large Democratic majority, 31 Democrats, 9 Republicans. And so if you take the 20 districts that are not up for re-election this cycle, the Democrats hold a 17-3 advantage. So they're kind of entering already with this large advantage. And under the new maps, the prediction is that the Democrats are favored in 14 of the 20 seats up for election. So one would expect the Democrats to control 30 to 31 seats in the Senate. So they currently hold 31. maybe lose a seat, maybe kind of hold steady. Again, that's well above the threshold needed for a supermajority. So not only is the California legislature very democratic, they have supermajorities in both the Assembly and the Senate. And so why is a supermajority potentially relevant for policymaking in the next 2 years? Well, you combine that with the governor election, which is going on, and Governor Newsom, the incumbent running for re-election, as we know, at least according to recent polls, has a sizable lead over his Republican challenger. The most recent poll from the Public Policy Institute of California has it at 58-31. So one should anticipate a Democratic governor with Democratic supermajorities in the legislature. So policymaking again will be controlled by the Democratic Party here in California. So, okay, so here's the slide on why a 2/3 supermajority is relevant. So some of you now realizing we're 12, 13 years away from the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. But in 2010, in the kind of the wake of the Great Recession, through the proposition system, Californians passed Prop 26, which reduced the number of legislative votes needed to pass a budget. So it used to be that you needed 2/3 votes in each chamber to pass a budget, created all sorts of crises every year as the legislature found it difficult to do that, especially in times of economic recession as we were facing in 2008, 2009. So they reduced the number of legislators needed to pass a budget. But where a supermajority remains relevant is that any tax increase requires a supermajority. So this is one reason why the Democrats might see some value in maintaining a supermajority, especially if economic forecasts or economic conditions take a downturn over the next couple of years. And so in addition to tax increases, any constitutional amendments or general obligation bonds can also be put onto the ballot with a 2/3 supermajority. So the Democrats are almost certainly likely to retain their majority and also to have this supermajority. So that's why that's relevant. Okay, so how does the California legislature look compared to other states? Just as with the public opinion data, this probably will not be too surprising, but we're a very liberal state. Our state legislature, just as our public is very liberal, our state legislature is quite liberal. And so this is a somewhat similar graphic to what Professor Heighton showed, but this is looking at the ideology of legislators in state legislatures. I'm not going to go into detail about the methodology, but using roll call votes, the nice thing about legislators and for political scientists is they cast lots of votes on lots of different policy issues. And using various statistical techniques, we can come up with measures of how liberal or conservative a legislator is. And then we can average that across individuals to come up with an average liberal or conservative score for a state legislature. And so that's what this is showing. The y-axis is showing the a stem for each lower chamber across the state, how liberal or conservative the state assembly is. Higher numbers mean more conservative, lower numbers mean more liberal. That's the way that this is scaled. And California is in black here. So just as with the public opinion data, the California legislature is quite liberal. It's over there with our Northeast counterparts, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maryland. And then on the right side on the axis there, you can see the more conservative state assemblies: Utah, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Idaho. So again, probably not too surprising, but it's interesting to kind of look at this compared to other states, that California is among the most relatively liberal in the US. So one way to look at this is kind of this snapshot comparing California at this point in time to other state assemblies. Just as Professor Heighten did with the presidential election data, we can also look at this over time. And so I put together a comparison of how California has moved over time. And so this kind of a little hard to see, but think of this as going from 1992 up through 2020 on the x-axis here, and then up and down on the y-axis is higher numbers are more conservative, lower numbers are more liberal. And so what this is showing is how has California's assembly moved over time, and you can see that it's gone in a more liberal direction since 1992. This is in keeping with the kind of the earlier part of our presentation, is that California was not always this liberal, and it's in recent political memory for some of us that it wasn't quite this liberal. And then we picked some other large representative states to kind of see how this is moving over time. You can see Georgia, for example, becoming much more conservative over time, Texas becoming much more conservative over time. So another kind of interesting thing about the political moment that we're living in is not only is the national political scene quite polarized, increasingly what we're seeing are the states becoming polarized. We're increasingly becoming Democratic states versus Republican states. But that's a fairly recent development over the last 20 years or so. We can talk more about why that might be. Okay. Now, okay, so California is very Democratic, very liberal. I have similar data for the state Senate, but it's just telling the same story, so I won't belabor that. But you can see that. One other thing we don't have a graphic for, but I will point out is that if you look at the differences between Democrats and Republicans in state legislatures, by these metrics, the California legislature is the most polarized legislature in the country. That is, the average Democrat is further left than the average Republican is right. So that's another feature of California. Given the large Democratic majorities in California, that's probably not too surprising. Republicans are routinely losing on roll call votes here in California. Okay, and this is the final slide that I'll show, and then we can take questions. But it is one of our themes that we've been hammering home here is the democraticness and liberalness of the state of California. But it is always important to remember in our two-party system that political parties are coalitions of diverse interests. And that is certainly true of the Democratic Party in California. There remain tensions among Democratic legislators, I should say, in the Assembly and Senate, most notably between moderates and the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And we can see examples of that play out both in the state legislature, whether the issue of single-payer healthcare, which progressives were pushing for in recent sessions, wealth tax. You can also see at the either ballot proposition level or local level tensions between members of the Democratic coalition, issues over affirmative action in university admissions, which was on the ballot 2 years ago and failed. Issues of criminal justice, recall in San Francisco, or housing policy, doesn't always unify Democrats. Those who are dependent on their home equity are less amenable to building new developments in their localities. And so this is all just a kind of examples of, or a way to say that even though the state is, in one sense, compared to the rest of the country, very democratic and very liberal, there are still interesting political divisions that happen within political parties. And then likewise on the Republican side, there are certainly tensions, as we know, nationally within the Republican Party, and one can see that in some aspects of California's politics. And there's a recent New York Times story discussing the tensions between establishment and far-right activists in places like Shasta County in Northern California. Okay, with that, I think I will stop and then we'll turn it over to questions, or if there's any other further data you want to show.
So much, Professor Height.
I'm going to go back to this slide.
Okay, so what we're going to do is, since we do have folks who are here physically as well as those virtually. So if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, if you have a question to ask, I will go ahead and call on you, and we'll actually alternate between those in the room and those on the phone who have been joining us virtually. So first, if anyone here has any questions